Hi, guys, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Jenna.
And I'm your host, Holly.
And today we're talking about magic and our roots. So, everything from the magic in our ancestors to our personal beliefs and understandings growing up and how it got us here, and as well as to our local roots in the different areas in which we reside, and some caveats about that as well.
And there's going to be a lot to cover here, so we are going to fit it into our normal episode length. But if there's anything that interests you specifically, feel free to let us know in the comments down below, and we will take a deeper dive in future episodes.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot to fall under this like magic in your roots kind of area. And we were even discussing before the podcast started filming of like, okay, which order do we want to do this in? What do we want to talk about and tap into a little bit? But if there's anything you want to deeper dive into, we can definitely jump into that.
Yeah, so in terms of order, we're going to start off by just giving you a bit of our background, so ancestral, our heritage, where we're coming from, where our ancestors came from, and what sort of rituals and what sort of magic were going on in those cultures.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, for me personally, I'm predominantly Scandinavian Nordic. So a lot of my roots I found and connected to are in that area, but that's predominantly from my father's side. From my mother's side, we're definitely more Irish, Scottish, and my dad's side, we're a little bit German too. So there's not too much of a connection I find in my like German ancestry too much. I think simply because, my ancestors came in just before right during, I feel like, the rise of fascism and right around World War I, World War II, and they escaped it and came over to the U.S. Canada area to kind of escape that, and so they ended up kind of getting really Americanized and kind of lost a lot of their cultural identity and a lot of the things to be passed down. And my dad was also adopted, so he lost a lot of his roots in all of those things, and I've been kind of trying to reconnect those. And kind of be the reconnecting cultural piece between, what we kind of lost with a lot of immigration. His family as well came over during the potato famine, and they lost a lot of their identity in that, though stayed pretty strong, proud of being Irish. And then most of his family, though, was really proudly Scandinavian, and to this day, they're very strong in their roots. We still have cousins over in Sweden who like to keep a long diary of family history and ancestry and things like that. And so tapping into those roots have definitely been a little bit easier and a little bit more understanding. Like my siblings, Norse pagan, so they really connect with those roots that they have there. And my mom's side, it's just their connection to anything pagan and anything European in nature is pretty far removed, though they are predominantly Scottish and Irish as well. But their connection to that culturally and pagan wise is pretty far removed. But I do culturally connect with that, but not necessarily like witchcraft wise. I haven't found too much of a connection there, but definitely in my Scandinavian Nordic roots, I find a lot of comfort and a lot of witchcraft and a lot of paganism elements from that area that I resonate with personally, at least still.
Yeah, it's so interesting because we've talked about this on and off through the podcast about these things that we happen to have in common, which, we would have had no idea about going into this. And we have a lot of similarities in this area because, so my mom's side of the family is Ukrainian, Danish and English primarily, with some Swedish in there as well. And my dad's side of the family is just like fully Polish. I go by Holly Rhiannon on social media because it's a variation on my middle name, but my legal last name is no secret, and it's Kędzierski, which is, it means son of the decorator in Polish. So I technically should have the last name Kędzierska. But on both sides of the family, we're a couple generations in. Both of my great grandparents, all four of my great grandparents, I think. I get a bit mixed up on it, but they came over at the great grandparents level. I always get mixed up. Is it like third generation? Anyhow, we're not that far back. We were not here when things were founded in Canada, but. In my granny's case, especially being Ukrainian, she came over when she was pretty young, and she grew up in Canada, and her whole thing was that she was Canadian. She was, she was assimilating. She did away with a lot of the traditional Ukrainian culture, especially for her. Like, religion was something she was not interested in. She was like violently anti-religious, and you have a lot of like hardcore Catholicism in the Ukrainian culture. Same with Polish. So my dad's side of the family, they were always more religious, and I was not really connected with them. So my mom, with her English, sort of Swedish, Danish, Ukrainian background, what she had was primarily this tie to English magic. So she raised me, I wouldn't say like very pagan, but that is the closest we had to a religion. Like, every time we would celebrate holidays, like our Christmas, we would sort of, we would do Ukrainian Christmas, and it would be a very pagan holiday. We would call it Christmas, but we would listen to Celtic music, and we would celebrate solstice and all of that. So that's kind of what I had. But the main thing was that a lot of that further back magic that you would see, the paganism in like Ukrainian, Polish culture, much like that culture at large, I completely lost that. And it's something I've been wanting to get back to personally as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm seeing this a lot personally on like TikTok and just in my own social circles. It's a lot of people who are either American or Canadian, a lot of people from European descent who are trying to reconnect with their cultural roots in other countries, because we have it's kind of an offshoot of the topic a little bit, but we definitely have had over the generations a lot of you're American, you're Canadian, be proud of the country you come from, and you end up to assimilate, you end up losing a lot of that cultural identity. And then what we see in the recent years is that there's all these European white people like us who are yearning for a culture, but then what they do is they go and appropriate other culture they see around them, because it's the only thing that they have active access to is the Hispanic or Black cultures around them that have innately kind of indigenous
Indigenous.
cultures that are around here. Like, I grew up predominantly with Hispanic people around me and Hispanic culture, and a lot of people who are white like me who assimilated into that and appropriated it because it was conveniently there and they grew up with it and it was familiar, but they're appropriating it because it doesn't really belong to them. And simultaneously, I feel like a lot of the times they still feel this emptiness of like, this isn't really where I'm from, it's not where my ancestors are from, it's not what I feel connected to, but it's conveniently here and it gives me a sense of deep belonging because it's nostalgic for me, but not that it actually belongs to me. And so there's a lot of people who are trying to like reclaim a lot of their ancestral roots, go back to, back to Europe a lot of the time, go back to the places where their ancestors were from and reconnect there. And I think that's been a big movement recently that I think is going to be really valuable. We run the risk of also appropriating, obviously, the European countries that we came from, because we don't really belong there either now because of assimilation and because of the loss of roots and stuff like that. We don't have a full connection to it, but it's been really nice to see a lot of people trying to reconnect with those deeper connections. And I feel like that also ties into a lot of people reconnecting with paganism and old beliefs and older herbal remedies. Even I feel like we're really in the age of kind of returning to like the old ways in a lot of different ways, and I think it's been desperately needed because we've had such a manufactured world for so long. I think a lot of people are yearning for something a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. One of the things I'm most thankful for is the fact that my mom, held on to what she could culturally. She would always, like with our Ukrainian heritage, we at least had the food. That was a big thing. She would always make the food. She had an amazing experience when she went to Denmark and visited our last remaining relatives who were living there, and they were living in this fort, and they had a bunch of like priceless art and one of Napoleon's swords and all this stuff in their fort, and they were basically being allowed to live there by the government because they couldn't afford it, and they were allowed to live to the end of their days, and then the government was going to take it over. So if I were to visit now, I wouldn't have the experience my mom had, but she was very lucky to meet them, and she had a translator and stuff. So she started in my family, she started going back into that in a very big way, and passed on as much as she could to me, which I've appreciated a lot. And I love seeing that now that other people are trying to do this too, and take hold of their history, because it's so important. And when you are appropriating someone else's culture, whether it's, with a bad intention or not, because a lot of people do it and they just have no idea that they shouldn't be doing that. When you find your actual culture, it feels so much better. It feels right. It's in your blood. It feels, I don't know, it feels powerful. And that is a big thing that we can apply to magic. So it is really important to know your roots, I think.
Yeah, for me, I always say like it feels like coming home.
So I guess leading into, we've already called out a few of our our places that we are from. Just to reiterate, because I want to do more research into this, but I've got a little bit of a rundown for every place. And so we have Ukrainian, Polish, Swedish, Danish, and English. And I feel like people know a lot about English magic because that's kind of your most flogged magic system. You see that a lot of the time. We all know about, Arthurian Morgan Le Fay and the fairies, fae folk, all of that stuff. So that's pretty well covered, and I always knew a lot of that. But Ukrainian and Polish culture was really interesting for me looking into that, because it's different, but the two of them are quite similar. So with Ukrainian paganism, the other thing with these two cultures is they were heavily taken over by Christianity. So with Ukrainian magic traditions, you have a lot of folklore that's sort of intertwined with pagan and Christian influences, which is kind of interesting. And they have this wide spectrum of folk magic where you have divination, herbal remedies, and protective charms. So there's these embroidered towels, which are protective, called rushniki. And we also have the term for witches, which are known as vedma, and they're really prominent in legends and attributed with both benevolent as well as malevolent powers, which you'll see in a lot of different cultures, right? So the thing with Ukrainian and Polish magic is it's all very home based. So if you like cozy magic, that's kind of the place to go. Especially if you're a writer. I have to bring that in, right? If you're a writer and you're looking for sort of cozy magic, I highly recommend looking into Ukrainian and Polish folklore, because you're going to have a lot of home and hearth and herbalism and safeguarding of the family and ensuring prosperity. So you have a lot of integral cultural festivals. There's one called the Ivana Kupala Night, which emphasizes these traditions that are all about protection and the harvest and stuff like that. And with Polish rituals, you see a lot that evolved from Slavic pagan religions, which is kind of cool. And they witnessed a lot of persecution. Like Poland, there was a lot of persecution there. If you look into that history, it is extremely dark and extremely bloody, and a lot of people don't talk about it. But there is a book called Poland. And I remember my dad reading it, and he was angry for like a week at everyone he saw around him. And I haven't read it yet because I'm scared. But yeah, the Polish people have been through a lot. So there was a lot of persecution there. There were witch hunts in Poland. But still, this folk healing protection, these symbols they called the bazgroki, and I'm sure I'm going to mess up pronunciation on all of these again. Unfortunately, did not learn these languages. They also had their own version of tarot and scrying, which I didn't know before, which is very cool. And there's lots of mystical creatures, and they're influenced by, there was one, I think it was Paracelsus, who played a significant role, which sounds almost Grecian to me. That's something I want to look into more. But anyway, again, like Catholicism and paganism really shaped Polish magical practices, and there's quite this fusion there, and still very home-based, like in Ukraine. So that's my little essay of what I learned about Polish and Ukrainian magic when I was looking into this. One last little thing I want to mention is that Polish magic had this thing called sand pouring, which I did a little photo shoot about when I was trying to get back into my roots a bit more. So they would make symbols by pouring sand. And I think that's kind of cool because it's a strong connection to salt pouring in English magic. And whenever you see these connections across different cultures, I just love that so much. It's my favorite thing, just to think that these different cultures were all coming up with these things long before we had things like the internet, and they were all along this similar continuum, which I think says a lot about pagan beliefs.
Yeah, and I think that's so cool too, because I think too, if I kind of look on a map here, just to arrange myself a little bit on the map here, Poland and Ukraine too, they're pretty close to the border towards the Middle East too. So I wonder if it was some of the trade routes back in the day, which gave them some of the inspo for using sand rather than salt too, since they were closer to those areas. They were also closer to a lot of the seas and stuff like that, where they'd have more access to sand. So a lot of those things make sense on how that could have been translated from either Polish first over to England, and England kind of had a lot of salt trade, so it could have been easier for them to do that, or it could have been the opposite. It went from England to Poland, and then Poland kind of was like, you know what, we've got some sand instead. So I always find it really interesting how the cultures kind of can interact with that, or if it's, if you're not going based off of history and trade routes, it could very easily just be that there's really something to the idea of the sand and salt pouring, and that it just gets adapted separately in different ways at the same time across the globe. So it's either through trade, which is cool if you're a history buff like me, or it's through just a genuine connection to a magic that a lot of different magical practices that are really similar will end up across the globe from each other, which is really, really cool. Like even the hieroglyphs
I like
in Egypt, and then there's also like cave writing and the Aztec Mayan kind of paintings and carvings on their walls and their pyramids, completely different, sections of the earth. And they both came up with magic systems that had pyramids and paintings inside of them as part of their symbolism and their magic in different parts of the world, which I think is really cool too.
Yeah, I love that. I love the mention of the trade routes because I hadn't even, I hadn't even thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense. And again, it just, it expands my imagination about all of this and really makes me want to dig into it more and maybe do some writing about it, especially it being in my past. And my dad actually, he's in comics and he started doing a story. I won't give it away because it's not sold yet, so this is not out in the world, but he did a story that had some Polish magical elements in it, and he actually had someone turn it down because they said it would be too hard to explain. And I've just been endlessly confused and frustrated by this, because how in a world, quick rant of the day, how in a world where you have DC and Marvel, and that is, the type of company you're working for, and they have a million superheroes with totally ridiculous powers, how is some classic Polish magic hard to explain? Like that, I don't know how to feel about that.
Yeah, if they can't Americanize it for an American audience because the wordage is too hard or it's something a little bit different, like they just won't pick it up or they won't deal with it, which is really unfortunate. That's why we don't honestly see that much Eastern European stuff in fiction, and that's also the same reason why they end up not publishing anything south of the equator. I could say Mexico, Africa. They just want to be great and not include a lot of different cultures inside of a lot of magic or fantasy settings, because it's a little too difficult for our small American brains to understand. And racism.
Yeah, I told him, I was like, this smells a little bit racist.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the same reason why you don't get same reason why you don't end up getting like Romani stories or a lot of Jewish stories or a lot of Middle Eastern stories. You don't end up getting those just because there's one, a lot of stigma, and then two, because a lot of people don't talk about it, but there's still a lot of stigma against a lot of Eastern Europeans to a lot of different people. Because there's those smaller sects and communities that were, deeply harmed during the Holocaust, and other, similar events throughout European history. And sadly, it ends up impacting us even today, where those stories just aren't shared as widely as, say, an English story or even a Scottish or a Spanish one. But then, God forbid, you ever write like a Brazilian
Yeah.
story or like a Nigerian story, then those just aren't gonna get the love.
Yeah, as much as our, magic and good stuff gets passed on, a lot of the bullshit gets passed along through the ages as well. But Jenna, I think, well, you and I both have the Nordic heritage, so if you want to speak to that a little bit, since I've gone down the Slavic, Ukrainian, Polish rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of crossover in the different Nordic ones. And for some people who might not know, there's a little bit of a difference between Scandinavian and Nordic. So Scandinavian countries include like Denmark, Sweden, Norwegian or Norway, and Iceland. So those are, and kind of Greenland, kind of not. So those are going to be more of your classic Scandinavian places. But then when you say Nordic, you're also including Finland in there, and then also you're including the nomadic Sami tribes as well. So that kind of gives a broader inclusion. So when I say, I sometimes still mess it up because this is something I'm still learning too. But I personally have more Nordic
Yeah.
Connections and stuff like that. Predominantly my family, even today, still lives in Sweden. That's predominantly where my family was from. Though I do have a little bit of Finnish as well. And Finnish is a crazy thing I've been trying to learn about. Like Finnish mythology and stories, like their monsters are straight up like Lovecraftian in their mythology and their folklore.
I've seen bits of it.
I cannot pronounce a single thing.
Yeah.
I would try. I have definitely story ideas based off of some of those monsters that I think would be really fun to play with in a fictional sense, and not in a conjuring sense, because I don't want to actually see or deal with any of them. But it's fascinating. If you ever want to get like mind fucked by a folklore, go look at Finnish folklore. It's some crazy stuff. But I imagine they're I haven't looked too much into Finnish magic either, but if that gives you even kind of a taste, I bet it's similar along those lines. But for the most part, the rest of the mythology, other than Sami, ends up being really tied to Norse myth, which does include Finnish myth. They were also Vikings and or not Finnish myth. It ties into Swedish mythology and magic a lot, because there were Vikings from both of those countries predominantly, as well as Denmark. So those were kind of the three main countries, and then obviously Iceland later when the Vikings found it. Iceland actually has more of a connection to the Vikings than ever, because they were founded by Vikings. A lot of them are actual descendants of the real Vikings who were on ships together and went over towards Iceland, Greenland, and then North America. So they have a lot of roots. Their language and their dialect in Iceland is actually closer to the ancient Norse than what is currently spoken in Norway and Sweden. Oh, I got kicked off. Oh, I'm back now.
Okay.
I'm back. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm back. Okay. So yeah, their dialect is a little bit closer to the actual original Old Norse as well, and a little bit closer to what the Vikings spoke. But yeah, so that mythology of Norse, Odin, the Viking era, the Valhalla, all of that stuff was really predominantly around the majority of the area where my ancestors were from. The Swedish, or like the ancient Norse word for witch is vulva. So I'm learning a lot about their practices for my Viking fantasy novel. A lot of it had to do with, kind of seer energy, a lot of like visions. There was a lot of mushrooms that they would take for visions, as well as to be a berserker. So you would kind of, go high on mushrooms, get shirtless, and kill a bunch of people when you were a berserker. And then on the flip side, you would take, you'd probably burn some fun stuff and take some mushrooms, and you'd be able to see the future,
I definitely know both sides of those people who get, both ways when they take mushrooms.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of mushroom too. And obviously, like mushroom kind of based witchcraft and stuff, it makes perfect sense for the location that they're at, because obviously cold, wintry, wet places are going to grow a shit ton of mushrooms, and they're going to be utilized in that way for both witchcraft. Mushrooms were used in warcraft essentially with the berserkers and stuff. So it was used in a lot of different ways, on top of just being food and trade staples as well. So trying to get more into like the old vulva practices for witchcraft and implementing that in my own practice as well as into the book that I'm writing and everything like that. And the only other kind of thing that I know I need to reconnect to, and I definitely want to learn more about, is the Sami. I'm trying to fully reconnect with like that side of me on paper. According to the family stories, that's most likely what my family predominantly was, but there's no DNA test you can take that'll say that you're Sami because it's such a small population currently, and because they're so mixed. Part of them come from a more Asian background because they were in Asia. They went up towards the really high parts of Russia and then came over towards Scandinavia, but they were nomadic, so they were a little bit part of everything, similar to the Romani. And so there's no DNA test you can take. It's just fully through paperwork and family stories. My family in Sweden won't really tell me that that's what they were because they were persecuted and put in residential schools the same way that the indigenous people in the Americas were, and they got a lot of just brutal, horrible things that happened to them, unfortunately, and they're still not treated, or they don't have their treaties taken care of the way that they should. Just like in America here, they're the indigenous people of that higher up area in the Nordic countries and over towards Russia as well. But even my family's kind of tipped their nose and kind of been like, well, our family was nomadic and we herded, but I'm not going to tell you what we herded in the high up section of Sweden. But it's like, okay, well, what else could that have been? And I, as I was researching my family tree, I found it really, really interesting that I can't go back very far on my family tree for one of my family members because he had the last name that's really common. He had Anderson, and he hated being called Anderson. He was like, I hate that name. Don't call me that name. That's not my last name. And so he completely rejected this last name. And I always wondered why. All my family was like, yeah, no, he hated that name. When he immigrated to Canada, he actually changed his last name to be more Swedish. And typically your name would get more Americanized when you came over. It'd get, angelicized or, whatever else. They would take a complicated name and shorten it, but his name had already been simple, and so he actually made it more Swedish and more indigenous when he came over here, and he chose a really rare surname and something really old, almost ancient Norse in a way. And then he brought that over here, and he was like, do not call me Anderson ever again. I hate being like the fifth Anderson. And I ended up finding out that most likely what probably happened was that he was most likely Sami, taken from his home, put into residential school, and his last name was changed to Anderson, like many Sami where they were giving like the last name Larson or Anderson or other things like that. And I think that's why he very much hated that last name, and why even my cousin who lives in Sweden, he cannot find records on who his parents were or where he came from exactly. But after he grew up and everything and got out of the residential school, he still went back to herding, and we just don't know. We don't have documentation for what he was herding, or my family won't tell me what he was herding, but they were still nomadic, jumping between just a couple different, housing, herding areas and things like that. And some of those houses still stand today, which I'd be really interested in seeing, but they look very Sami and in inspo. So I'd be really interested in, I have a cousin up there who's trying to look for documentation for me to see if there's anything that still exists, so I can really confirm it before I try to dive deeper into that culture and that heritage and understand, especially their old magic ways, because I find small indigenous groups have really close-knit bonds with each other, as well as close-knit to their ancestors and their ways of magic and everything. And I'd be really interested to learn more about that, but that's something I haven't fully dived into because I don't want to culturally appropriate, just on the off chance that I'm not accurate in my guesstimate on what that was. But I think it would make the most sense, and I think my cousins are in agreement on that as well. So
it sounds like it. That's I just have to say before I forget, it's so interesting you mentioning the sort of nomadic and the Asian influence and stuff like that, because in Poland it was invaded a lot. Like that's one of the reasons why I was mentioning about the bloodshed and stuff. Like there was a Polish Holocaust, which no one really knows about. It was, a very difficult culture to be in. And one of the things that you sort of know when you're of Polish descent is that you had a time period where, now I'm sorry if I'm calling this out wrong, I'm pretty sure it was the Swedes. I should have looked this up. I didn't know I was going to bring it up. I know for sure. So there are blonde Poles and there are dark-haired Poles. And it sort of depended on who was occupying Poland at the time. So Me, I'm like, my lineage is dark haired Polish. The blonde is fake, obviously. And So we were dark haired, which meant that the Huns were occupying when, you know, my lineage was active. And I've had people say a lot that I look Asian, which I don't think I do, but there's elements of that. So I do have this sort of Asian history in there too. And that's one of the things that, even though it was a dark history, I am very interested in learning about, which I don't even know how I would trace that back. Like you're saying with the nomadic tribes, like how do you trace back, who came in and, either non-consensually or consensually was with my Polish ancestor to produce this, this darker haired heritage from the Huns.
I think you wouldn't be able to find paperwork on that, obviously, because the Huns were, even longer ago, but it might still show up in your DNA. And if it doesn't,
Yeah.
it doesn't. But I think the only thing you'd be able to
That's
do
what I
is
was
a DNA test.
Yeah, definitely have to at some point.
I'll help you read your results. I'm really into that stuff, so I can help you kind of make some sense of it. I'm doing the same for a coworker of mine who's she's South African,
Okay.
but like she's a white South African, so she's like, I kind of know how my people got here, but I think she's saying like her dad was really dark, and so they were thinking that he might have actually been like part African or from maybe the Middle East or something, and she just has no idea. So she's waiting on her results right now so I can help her kind of make sense of of her whole ancestry, because that was another
Cool.
area of the world where you became like South African, like you weren't English anymore, you weren't this anymore, like assimilate
Yeah.
into the culture. That's
Yeah.
what you were. So she lost a lot of that along the way, and then also it was a part of an apartheid, which was not great, and she hates it, and so she fucking left.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, she
Yeah.
had that whole thing going on. So I'm going to help her kind of read into that. But I think it's, it's another example of a lot of people trying to reconnect with those roots and reconnect with a lot of old ancient ways that I think is going to be really beneficial for the world in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe we can do a DNA episode someday.
I would have the best time. Do it. Just let me know when your kit comes in. We'll
Yeah.
make an episode.
We'll have to do it.
You can just share screen and I'll explain it to
Okay,
you.
excellent. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, were there any other of the, historical magics you wanted to touch on before we get a little more, directly personal?
No, I don't think so. I definitely need to learn a little bit more about my Scottish and Irish, ancestry and stuff. But I feel like I learned a lot of that naturally just from growing up, because a lot of that crosses over with English mythology a lot of the time, and magics and stuff like that.
That's the thing.
So I feel like a lot of people know like the brownies, the fairies, like the locks. I totally believe in the Loch Ness monster. I think it was a dinosaur. If anyone's curious, uh, and yeah.
See, yeah, like I didn't get into it not because I don't love it. I absolutely adore it. It comes out in my writing all the time, but I just feel like, people know it. They know the English magic. They know.
They've all seen Harry Potter, so it's fine. The only other sort of connection that I have like genetically to anything is that I am like a sliver of like Middle Eastern. I'm pretty sure from like Lebanon area. It comes up in my DNA a little bit, and I've got a lot of cousins in Lebanon. But obviously, like I don't look Lebanese. But I've had a coworker in the past, and some of my siblings' friend, or no, it wasn't my coworker. It was my siblings' friends who told them like, "Are you sure you're not one of us?" And they were Lebanese. They're like, "Are you sure you really like our food?" Like even their mom when they would go over when they were kids was like, "I think you're one of us." And then we ended up seeing that little bit of the Middle Eastern in our DNA, and we were like, "Where the fuck did that come from?" And we ended up finding out that I think it was my great grandmother on my father's side from that same Scandinavian side. They're all Scandinavian Nordic except for this one woman who. She was ran out of the Middle East, I believe, by the Turks for her religious faith, and she was forced to again use the trade routes that went through the Middle East, or not the Middle East, but through the Middle East, up through Eastern Europe to get to Sweden, and there she tried to make herself as pale as possible and pass for white. But even in her photos that are black and white, you can kind of tell. And when I colorize the photos, it's obvious that she's not naturally European whatsoever.
Oh, wow.
And like she came in
That's a fascinating
Yeah,
story.
and I mean, she came in with a last name that when she moved to Sweden, she shortened from its full last name, which I wish I could share, but the family tree is just so small. I don't want to, this is from my dad's birth family, and I don't
Yeah.
want to put them out there too much. But especially because I think there's only like one person left with the last name, one or three or four actually, of my cousins and my uncle who had the last name anymore. So it'd be very easy to find them, and I don't really want to do that. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was, it's the last name my dad was born with, and it seems very, like American English, last name, but it's because it's literally the first half of a much longer last name that when you actually look at it and you look at the history of it, you can literally see that the only thing it is tied to in this entire world is specifically that religion in the Middle East. And so I definitely want to learn
Oh wow.
more about that religion in general, and definitely like a lot of their magic and stuff from back in the day and stuff like that. But I also don't want to risk appropriating because even though it is
Mm-hmm.
pretty close to me in my family tree, I do not look Middle Eastern. Like I don't look Lebanese.
Yeah, but it's still in you,
Yeah,
right? Like even if you don't present that way,
yeah.
there are a lot of people who don't present with with their background.
Yeah, I just, it's a little bit of like a iffy spot to be in because it's like I want to have that knowledge and maybe, personally in private practice a little bit, but it's not something that I want to share too much just because I don't want to come across like I'm appropriating. I don't want to, if I have my facts crossed at some point because I am looking at like, very old in different language documents. If I translated something wrong, and I'm incorrect, then I don't want to put too much of that. I'm pretty
Hmm.
fucking sure. Like when you colorize a photo of someone who's labeled as
Hmm.
white and they're not white anymore, you're like, I'm pretty sure I know what happened here. And I've
Yeah.
even shown like my old Lebanese coworker. I was like, this is a picture of my great grandmother. What do you think? And she's like, that's my cousin.
Yeah.
But yeah,
It sounds like you're on the right path
yeah, those
there.
were the two of my most confusing parts in my ancestry testing. Was definitely when it showed up a little Middle Eastern, and I was like, huh? And then the other part was the Eastern European
Mm,
DNA, where I was like, okay, that just is broadly Eastern European. What does that mean? And apparently, if you have a little bit of the Finnish,
yeah.
Scandinavian, and Eastern European DNA show up in the way that it showed up for me, it most likely means that you have Sami ancestry. Because for Sami, some of them came
Hmm.
from Asia, and some of them were just Eastern European, Russian, other things like that, or their DNA shows up that way at least because they were integrated in. So your closest cousins are going to show up as being Russian. Like I have a cousin who is Russian. She moved to England,
Right.
but we're connected through that Sami DNA from my other great great grandparent. From the two different sides of the family tree that ended up creating my father, but it
Hmm.
just doesn't show up in the DNA wise. And then once I figured out that that's why it wasn't showing up, because literally there's not a large enough population to do DNA testing on, I got very sad.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating though, and if you can do more research on it, I feel like that's a real historical gem to
Yeah,
uncover.
I know my cousin is trying, but she's up there in age, and so I just don't think she can travel to do a lot of the physical document hunting down. And sadly, not everything is digitalized. But she told me where to get the info
Right.
from, but I would have to literally fly out to Sweden, have a translator with me, and physically go through stuff. So one day I probably will try to, uh, and cross my fingers.
It's a good reason to go to
But yeah,
Sweden.
I got cousins over there anyways, and it's a beautiful country, so I definitely want to go. I'd love to probably end up retiring there one day. Steven wants to retire in New Zealand,
Hmm.
so we'll see one day if there's ever a retirement for this
A bit
generation.
different. Yeah, yeah, we'll see about that. That's a whole
Yeah,
topic. Oh man. So honing in a little bit on our local regions, we were talking about this. How this is an important thing to cover. I think when we're talking about our roots is well, and you had said this blends into your personal roots as well. So we're going to get into some talk about where we are living, where we were, where we grew up, and the indigenous magic in those areas, and ways of sort of looking at that and understanding it from what I understand, from what Jenna understands. So I think I did kind of already cover my personal connections, like My parents have both been interested in our history. They've both wanted to learn more, and my mom has preserved as much as she could. So in my immediate realm, I had a lot of English magic, English paganism knowledge about that, and we had quite a bit of Swedish and Danish imagery around our house. We have the little, I was pointing this out because I saw that Jenna, you had on your fridge the little
Oh yeah,
horse. We have the little Danish horses and
I
stuff.
got
Like
one right here too.
they're super cute. So my mom always had that. There you go.
It's on her.
Exactly. So I grew up with a lot of that, a lot of the Gala, yes. I had a lot of the imagery around, but in terms of our real, roots, real paganism, it was heavily English because that's what we had access to. But I, grew up in Canada. I still live in Canada, even though I'm in Mexico at the moment, which has been amazing. More on that on my channel. Shameless vlog plug. But we have, we have Indigenous culture with a variety of tribes, Mohawk, Métis, and there are a variety of ingredients that a lot of people sort of default to using because they are, they're readily available. They're local. People immediately make that connection. We talked about this before of people who will be in search of some sort of roots for themselves, some sort of magic, something more connected to the earth, and they will automatically find what is in the region, which, it's an interesting start to learn about, but there are connections to those ingredients that are regional, that are connected to the Indigenous peoples, and there might even be things that are going extinct, and maybe we should be a little careful and a little more reverent and avoidant of them. In one of our previous podcasts, I did talk about ingredients that are culturally specific to, I believe it was English people, and you can find them everywhere. Like look this up, look up your roots, look up, plants that can be found in, Poland, in England, and you will find things in your bloody grocery store that you can use. So there's always going to be something that can connect you with your roots when you are practicing magic. A couple things that if you are Canadian, you should avoid. Primarily white sage. People are very into saging their homes right now. It is very Instagram trendy, but its popularity of this particular ingredient, it has led to environmental concerns due to overharvesting. And it has been poached as well. And I believe this extends into the States too, right, Jenna? Like in California, I think there's poaching of it
Yeah,
specifically.
it's poaching and then environmental hazard. It's also going extinct, and I found out, of course, I did not know at the time, a long time ago, before I heard it was extinct or anything. I had bought some, and I didn't find out until way after the fact that it was going extinct. All the poaching was happening, and then I also found out it's also a close practice for Indigenous people. So that all wrapped
Yes.
up together just means please don't use it. And I believe the same thing applies to Palo Santo as well.
Okay, and I think the other primary one in Canada that I was thinking of is sweetgrass.
Mm.
Cedar is also one, but these traditional plants like sweetgrass is not as problematic because the overall issue is commercialization, but there is absolutely appropriation because this is used for smudging and spiritual cleansing, and heavily utilized in Indigenous spiritual practices. I could be wrong, but I don't believe sweetgrass is closed the way that sage is, but it is still a very important item in Indigenous Canadian practice. And it's not, that's where its roots are. They are not elsewhere. So you don't need sweetgrass. You absolutely do not. You can find other things to utilize. And I think one last thing I just want to say about these specific Canadian ingredients I thought of is just that for a lot of people, they'll be like, well, I'm going to use it anyway because I don't care. Like, I don't care about appropriating. I just want to do the trendy thing. If you want to think about yourself personally, your magic isn't going to go well if you're using something that isn't appropriate. Magic is a lot about your energy and a lot about history. And if you're fucking with that stuff, your magic isn't going to be good. It's not going to be powerful. It's not going to be positive. So even if you are thinking, whatever, I just wanted to pick up that little bit of sage that I found at the store, like that I found online or something on Etsy because it's cool and it's trendy. Just don't. If you actually care about your practice, just avoid it. It's really not that hard, and you can always find more appropriate alternatives.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know about sweetgrass 100%, so I'm not gonna speak on it. But at least for the white
Mm.
sage thing, definitely yes. And there's also, I wanted to say, there's a distinction between using something that's a close practice in your own personal practice, which is bad, or taking it upon yourself to get something that's an endangered plant as well. That's not cool either. Like magic is a lot about nature. Like, calm down. But then on top of that too,
Yes.
it's different too. It's different too if you're welcome into someone else's practice. So if like an indigenous person welcomes you into their space, or if someone else from a different
Yes.
culture invites you into their space and you want to partake in what they're inviting you to, then like that's a different situation. If anyone's going to use white sage specifically as well, it's going to be an indigenous person. And I've seen sometimes too people talking shit to indigenous people for using white sage because it's endangered. I'm like, well, it's endangered because people like us. It's not endangered because of them. Like they're actively taking care of the environment for the fucking most part.
No, they've been taking care, using it properly for decades and
Yeah.
decades. No.
It's like calm your horse, Karen. It's fine if they want to use it, and a lot of people get pissed off when other people get to use something, but then I don't have my turn. It's like, okay, well, if you're actually chill, you might just get invited to a place, or like an actual powwow you could go to or something where you can like help donate to a cause they might be fundraising for or whatever, and you might be able to still kind of partake in something that you find interesting, but do so respectfully. And that I think is a huge difference. So like as we kind of tie it back into like our own upbringing and stuff like that, from my perspective as well, I was raised a lot with there's for people who don't know, there's predominantly two different sects of like Mexican magic, and predominantly I'm in California, SoCal. We have a lot of Hispanic people. Obviously, I'm married to a very handsome one now. I also got engaged recently. That's why we were on hiatus for saying. But predominantly there's
Yes, very important. Congratulations.
but so yeah, I predominantly grew up with two different types of Mexican magic for the most part, and both of them are kind of a little bit tied with like Spanish as well as indigenous. There was a lot of blending of those things historically, so it makes sense. So one of the main ones is bruja. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Bruja. It's like bruja with an ira on the end. That's the Spanish word for witch for the most part. I didn't really grow up with that one too much, but that's the one you're going to popularly see in a lot of movies and stuff. The other one is Santeria, which is a little bit more of like a mix of like Afro-Latino, a lot of like black influence, so it looks a little bit more like voodoo, and then also has a little bit more of that indigenous and Spanish blend to it, and it's predominantly from like Cuba. But there's also huge sects in Mexico who still utilize it, and at least for me growing up, where I was and the people that my family knew predominantly had connections to Santeria magic, so I grew up with that magic, which if you look into it, it's probably the most crazy looking magic rituals you've ever seen, but they're so cool and they so work. I will say though, it's again a situation of if you're invited into this space, that's one thing, but don't try to go and take this really cool magic that's not yours, because it is such a unique blend to very specific people, and it's not as popular as the other type of magic, the brujeria. I can't roll my R's, that's why it's difficult. But that's what I grew up with, and I grew up with stories of, and it was it's a weird blend of like Catholicism, Christianity, voodoo, black indigenous culture blending together to create this really cool interesting thing. But it's a really wild and really interesting time if you guys ever look it up.
That's one thing that I have seen little bits of that. I would like to look into it more, especially being in Mexico right now. One thing that I really appreciated when I was younger, because I grew up in Manitoba, which is unfortunately, it's the most racist province in Canada towards Indigenous people. Um, and part of that is because we have the most Indigenous reserves. And to clarify, I'm not saying that it's their fault. I mean, there's a large population, and then there's a large population of white people who are of a very small town mentality, and combined together, you get a lot of not good stuff. But that being said, I was very lucky in my schools. We were educated a lot on the Indigenous cultures, and our art gallery was full of really amazing Indigenous art, like the biggest collection in the world, I think. Well, in Canada, because it's specifically Canadian. But we had a lot of exposure. And one of the things that I loved is that we had a lot of that inviting in. So we got to go to a lot of places where they were inviting us. They were showing us, different different traditions, whether it was around food or ritual. And when you get to see something that way, if you do genuinely care about that culture and about if that's why you're interested in something like white sage, that is how you do want to see it, right? Like you don't want to see it in a way where you're trying to take that away from someone. And it's just so much more rewarding and fascinating to do it properly.
Yeah, and I think too, it's a way for you to step into a completely different culture without appropriating it, but rather doing it in a way of appreciation, especially if you're, invited as a guest or
Mm-hmm.
you're doing something to contribute, whether it's you're sharing your own culture to other people or whether it's you like doing some sort of donation if they're having like a fundraiser going on, if they're trying to, bring notice to a specific cause. All of that is super beneficial, and I think it's the way that you want to be introduced to another culture, not through you just looking at something going, oh, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
cool, let me just go and boop, take that for myself. Like, sure, that's the easy thing to do, but
Yoink.
the easy thing to do is rarely ever the right thing to do.
Yeah. So I think that we've covered quite a bit here. I find I believe I say that a lot in our episodes, but that's just what we do. These are heavy knowledge based podcasts. I hope that everyone enjoys them. But I think that's pretty much all I wanted to get at for now. Like I said, there's a lot that I really want to research more of. But I don't know about you, Jenna. Do you have anything more to add for this session?
Yeah. I mean, I think, we say that all the time. I think and a large portion of that is because we bounce off each other really well, but then too, I talk really fast. I, I had a very kind person comment on one of my videos, and they said, I wish I could type as fast as she talks. And I was like, me too, Paul. Me too.
That's never stood out to me in any major way. I don't know. I feel like your speech speed is very palatable to
That's
me.
good to hear because I get that all the time. We're like, she talks fast. I had to slow down your video, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm talking normally. But then meanwhile, I have to like play YouTube videos and my teachers on like 2x speed, so because I think they talk too slow.
So you talk quickly and you hear quickly.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, my sibling literally says like all the time, like, how are you understanding anything that they're saying? And I'm like, I just hear better when it's fast. um, but
You're a fast processor.
yeah, I guess so. But yeah, the only other thing is I did want to share a fun story of Santeria from my youth as well. I'm gonna look at some pictures of it to just get some inspo real quick and really dive into the story. But my mom all the time, she had we had connections to the Mexican mafia or like an ex member of the Mexican mafia, one of the cartels, and they had surprisingly a deep connection with Santeria and Brujeria and all of the Mexican witchcrafts and stuff like that. And so by extension, she had connection as well as the fact that my older brother, who's my half brother, he's half Hispanic. So I grew up with my Nana Lisa, who's Mexican and everything, and she had connections too. So all the time we grew up with like these weird like stories from my mom. Like one time she said she got cursed by somebody and she had to be rubbed down with a dove, and so this guy like just shaman came over and had her get down to like the bare essentials of her clothes and just rubbed her down with a dove and released it, so then the dove was cursed instead of her. And then other times where they had
Amazing.
like to roll a chicken across the floor for some reason. There's a lot of animals in Santeria, I notice. It's some of the classic ways they do end up having to like kill the animal afterwards and like eat it or bury it or something like that. That's
Mm-hmm,
another one of those
mm-hmm.
practices, at least, where they try to use like every part of the animal if they do have to kill the animal. It's not like for a sacrificial kind of thing. It's more of like a cleansing thing.
Yes.
And I noticed a lot of cultures and different pagan beliefs do that as well. And one of the things that I learned from a
Mm-hmm.
young age that is actually really, really funny, because it's a practice that I still keep to this day, and it's actually connected to Stephen grew up with it in a different context. So I found it really interesting. My mom and my sibling, we both told me at different points in my life, like, oh, you can use eggs to see if you're cursed, and you can use eggs to cleanse yourself. And so
Yeah,
I've done
yeah.
things where I've removed negative energies and curses and from myself, and then you can literally revert back the curse or the negative energy to whoever put it upon you. I probably have to do this soon because I can feel the negative
Mhm.
energy on me. But I just had like it wasn't like a Mercury retrograde, but I just had every single thing in my life going wrong, and usually that's only during Mercury retrograde. So I was like, "What's happening?" And I ended up doing the egg decurse thing, which I guess is sort of a Santeria thing, and it's kind of become mainstream. A lot of, I guess, witches do it and everything, but it very much so reminds me of Santeria, because chicken rolling on the ground, roll an egg across you to see if you're cursed. I feel like it's connected, you know. Um, and so I ended up doing that, and I ended up reverting back the curse to the other person. And I was like, I'm pretty sure it's this person giving me all these negative vibes and energy. And as soon as I did that, the very next day I woke up, my life like completely changed. All of the bad stuff just went away. All the things I was scared of didn't happen before, like everything I feared happened. And then I found out on the flip side, a bunch of bad stuff happened to the person I suspected of having put the curse on me, got it all back basically, and literally went into situations that I had been in that I'd been upset about. And so literally I just reverted it back to them. And I thought that was like really cool how it kind of manifested in that way. But there's also a really cool trick that I learned from Stephen and his family. And this is coming from like his mom is a nurse, and she even still does this kind of practice, and it's more medicinal in nature. So she says instead, rub an
Mhm.
egg across you. You have a fever, you have a cold, just rub an egg on your face, rub it on your whole body, and you're gonna just keep doing it, right? And it's crazy because it actually does reduce your fever, cools you down, and then you can tell how bad of a fever you have of if you have cooked the egg or not when you crack it. It was partially cooked, you're running too high of a fever, and you could die. So
Right.
I've done that several times now where I've had a cold, I'm running a fever, I'll rub an egg across me, I'll feel better, my fever will go down, and I crack the egg and it's cooked, and then I wait a little bit and I don't have a fever anymore. So it's literally like transferring the curse of my sickness onto the egg, but in a more medicinal, like doctor kind of way. And it makes scientific reason why a
Yeah.
cold egg from the fridge would do that to your body. Because it's like an ice cube, but it actually can take the heat away because it has something to go into, whereas ice is just purely cold. It can't do anything. There's no chemical reaction that can happen. So I thought it was really interesting that two different ways you could use eggs. You could use it medicinally as like an herbal kind of remedy kind of thing that's pretty old, and then you could also use it in a witchcraft practice, and both of them involve rubbing an egg on you, and either your egg will come out black or green or weird based off of the negative energy, or your egg will be cooked based off of the fever that you have. And there's two different ways that you can use this egg to figure out like bad things that are happening with you. So eggs are magic. I don't eat them, I'll rub them on my body.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was gonna say, as a vegan, I'm sitting here trying to calculate, can I do this?
Yeah, I don't think it'll work with any egg substitutes, I'm sorry.
No, just get out like the just egg patty and rub it all over my face. What color are you?
It's like a mood ring, but it's a curse, like Patty.
Curse
New
patty.
t-shirt, curse Patty.
I'm writing it down. I have the list now. I still haven't gone back to
Oh,
the other ones, but I'm writing that down. Curse patty.
I love that. I can't wait.
uh, I think that's a perfect note for us to wrap this up on. I love that story. That's amazing. I definitely want to explore more about eggs now.
Yeah, I think it'll be beneficial if you can ethically decide.
Yeah. I'll keep you
So
updated.
awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you liked this episode, and remember to break out your cursed patties whenever needed.
May they always retain their light and innocent color.
Blessed be.